Um, I know people are still getting in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. It's great that you all were able to join us today for our program, With Dignity and Respect, Returning Indigenous Remains in West Michigan. My name is Nora Salas, and I'm the director of the Cucci Office of Local History here at Grand Valley State University. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that GVSU sits on the ancestral lands of the people of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and Ottawa peoples, known as the Anishinaabeg. As an institution, Grand Valley State University has had both positive and negative interactions with Indigenous people in its history. In light of this legacy, we here at the Cucci office acknowledge the ongoing need to challenge ourselves to create meaningful inclusion. Teaching and reflecting about past efforts in this direction is an important part of this process that we are engaging in presently. So with that, I would like to also mention that the Cucci Office of Local History was founded to give voice to diverse communities through history. We do this work through a variety of projects and programs, and one of these is the Grand Rapids Time Traveler series that you're joining us for today. With this series, we've kind of been moving through the decades, and today we are fortunate to welcome two local experts to our conversation, J. Sam and Dr. Janet Brashler. J. Sam is currently the director of the Historic Preservation Department of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, and Dr. Jan Brashler is an anthropologist who worked with Sam in the 1990s on returning remains of Native Americans held by GVSU to that tribe. Both are experts on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, generally called Nagpra for short, which was enacted in 1990. For many years, Jan taught anthropology here at Grand Valley State University, so we are happy she's able to rejoin us for this event. As part of his work, J. Sam coordinates the repatriation of Indigenous remains to the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians and also works with a statewide coalition of Native American nations dealing with this issue. Today, Jay and Jan will be joining us for a conversation about their experiences with this important topic in West Michigan. One last note before we begin. If you are with us today in Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature if you have questions to be addressed, and we'll sort of stockpile those questions until we get to the end of the pre-prepared questions for our panelists. If you are watching on the YouTube live stream at some point during this event, you should be able to comment questions as well. Please note, though, that we might not get to all the audience questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available online soon. So thank you again for coming today. And now, actually, I'm going to turn it over to our guest, Jan Brashler, to talk to us a little bit about the basics of Nagpra, a general sort of orientation to what it is and was. Thanks, Jan.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nora, for the opportunity to do this. As Nora mentioned, Nagpra stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, kind of a mouthful. It is a law passed by the United States Congress, introduced into the Senate by Senator Daniel Inouye, who is a native Hawaiian representing the state of Hawaii. He introduced the bill in 1990 and combined that bill with one that John McCain, interestingly, had introduced regarding protection of burials on federal lands. And so what happened was the two streams, the protection of burials on federal lands and the repatriation of burials and other items, were co-joined in this one act. It was signed into law on November 16th by the first President Bush in 1990. And essentially, the law was passed to resolve a century-long, or more than century-long, conflict over the disposition or the treatment of Native American remains, funerary items that were associated with Native American burials, sacred items, and by sacred items, these might be ethnographic or things collected in the 19th century, like ceremonial pipes, for example, and other items of cultural patrimony, or things that have value to an entire culture, not associated with any one individual, but sacred items that speak broadly to a particular culture. The law and the subsequent regulations that were written outline the rights and responsibilities of Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Alaskan Native villages, and the lineal descendants of individuals who once lived on this land, on the one hand, and then federal agencies and organizations such as museums and universities that receive federal funding on the other hand. And so there is a split, a dichotomy between the federal agencies and those organizations that receive federal funding and the indigenous people of the United States. So what it does, is what the regulations do are a number of things. They set up a compliance process, and this is probably the most meaty portion of the law and the regulations. It's a compliance process and procedures that agencies and tribes must follow to return human remains, funerary objects, or items buried with the remains, and sacred items and objects of cultural patrimony. It sets up a process for that to happen. Nagpra is set up under the Secretary of Interior, and interestingly enough, a little tiny conflict of interest, the Park Service, who is one of the agencies that held remains at one time. It sets up the National Nagpra program to implement the legislation by establishing a review committee to monitor compliance, to facilitate the resolution of disputes. It reports to Congress, and this review committee consists of 7 members. 3 are traditional tribal individuals, 3 represent museums, and 1 is an at-large person. So the committee was established to provide some balance between the 2 competing interests. National Nagpra drafted the regulations to implement Nagpra in consultation with the review committee. And this occurred during the 1990s. The original regulations were developed in 1990-91. And then a second round of regulations were developed in the year 2000, and we can talk about that a little bit later. National Nagpra maintains databases for Nagpra inventories and summaries. These are published in the Federal Register, which is any person can access this and see what individual universities, museums, tribes, how their involvement. It's a public document, or a series of public documents. National Nagpra also provides and administers grants to Native American tribes and villages and to museums to facilitate the repatriation. National Nagpra also provides training and outreach, and it informs the Secretary of the Interior on penalties imposed on institutions failing to comply. So that's, a lot of mumbo maybe, but that's what Nagpra does in a nutshell. Basically sets up a process, a procedure for institutions to first inventory and then begin the process of consultation with tribes with regard to the return of remains. So is that?
Thank you, Jan, for that. That was a quick summary of what is a complex law that has existed now for 30 years, and, you know, is still being sort of processed in many areas of the country. And so next, what I'd like to hear from both of you about is sort of the historical relationship between Indigenous people, museums, and universities that studied Native American history and culture. Sort of what can you tell us about the background that led to the creation in some ways of Nagpra in the 1990s? So I think maybe we should begin, Jay, if it's okay with you this time.
All right, I can go ahead and take a shot at this. One of the things that is not completely understood even today as we deal with these things is the tribal individual, the tribal relationship to the remains that were in their area or that they were taking care of in their region. And one of the things they had a problem all the time with was museums would end up with people, sometimes professional people doing it, sometimes hobbyists, so to speak, digging things up because they found them and then taking them to a museum. And the tribes would go to the museum to say, don't do this, or don't display these, or don't whatever. And in a lot of cases, the museums would ignore them. They'd ignore the tribal folks in the past, and they would just keep the remains on display. When it became apparent that that was a bad practice under the laws, they took them out of display, but they kept them in inventories. Universities kept things like that in inventories, and the tribes always felt they were kind of holding hostages. That for us, those ancestors are with us, even though they're in the spirit world. And because you're not able to access where they're located necessarily, they're not as accessible or able to be treated with the honor and respect you want to have, especially in things like ghost suppers and some of the events we have that do that. Through the years, some of the universities have been openly hostile to conforming with Nagpra. Some of them have been questioning and challenging and fighting. I'm going to say it right here, happily, Grand Valley was not one of those. We worked fairly well together, and we've even appreciated that the remains we repatriated from there, the bulk of them, came from a site we had no control over either. But Jan and the folks at Grand Valley took an effort to make sure that that site just didn't disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to fight with the state for 4 years, 3 years, something like that, to get them to take any measures to stop the site from disappearing because it was eroding.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally would say that that site was very important. The Battle Point site for me, because my great-great-grandfather used to be the Gima or leader of that village.
Mm-hmm.
So some universities went forward and complied and did what was the right thing. Others have fought. In fact, I was just saying earlier before we started that we just started repatriating more remains from the University of Michigan, from Michigan State. We've had, as the Nagpra organization, we've been successful moving around at the Peabody Museum for Harvard and other places of that nature, in such that we've gotten up to a point today where at least the inventories that were required to be done in the 90s are actually on record finally. A lot of universities avoided that. And that's how the relationship between the tribes and the folks trying to honor what they call their ancestors and their history, and the folks who resisted, it's always been kind of contentious. Now it's less contentious because more persons are in positions to make those decisions who have actually seen that this is something that is right to do. Just as I said, just as Grand Valley did years and years ago, 30 years ago, they were wanting to do that. That's been the case for us, is that there's been issues where we've had to go to the National Nagpra organization. We've had to threaten litigation, some of the tribes have, to get universities to move forward, because for some reason they don't want to acknowledge what Nagpra acknowledges.
Yes.
It's getting better. It's gotten a little better. I mean, a lot. Actually, it's gotten a lot better. We're consulting and moving forward and repatriating things.
Yes. Well, thank you, Jay, for sharing that, and especially for talking about your own personal family members. And we're going to get a little bit more into the situation with the Battle Point site, I think, in just a moment, because that is very directly related to Grand Valley State University. Before we do that, I wanted to give Jan a chance to talk about, you know, in a general sense, for those people listening who might not be aware of it, how did various museums and universities come to be in possession of so many remains of Native American people in the first place? Sort of what's kind of behind that? Because I'm not sure everybody is aware or thinking about that. And then maybe we can go to how did Grand Valley State University in particular, as a local example, come to be in possession of remains from the Battle Point site. For those of you who don't know, that's a location in present-day Ottawa County, not far from GVSU's Allendale campus. Jan, did you get all that?
Yep, I got it.
Okay, thanks.
So, you know, people, when Europeans first came to this continent, they were curious about the people who were here. And you know, the record of collecting archaeological materials and artifacts and indeed human remains goes back probably before the 19th century, but in the 19th century was the period when we were developing our nationhood, if you will. And at the same time, we were moving many tribes west of the Mississippi or north from the Grand River to the Manistee, or you know, annihilating people. And it became the policy of, and the understanding that maybe Native Americans were going to disappear. And so in the 1860s, there were directives from the government to begin collecting Native American skulls and ship them to the Army Medical Museum. And this followed along with other kinds of atrocities that were committed, but it became basically Native Americans were not considered to be human beings, but were considered to be objects of curiosity and science. And so even the first piece of antiquities legislation that was passed in 1906 establishes protection for archaeological remains, but it establishes also the philosophy that archaeological remains, including human remains, are property that can be owned by the United States government. So So, you know, this was an unfortunate, I'm sorry, this was an unfortunate, you know, culmination of a century and a half of terrible things that continued through the 20th century. And I just wanted to say a little tiny bit about my own personal experience. I started training as an archaeologist in 1968, which is the beginning of the awakening, if you will, of Native Americans, the beginning of a more vocal period protesting the policies of museums and asserting issues of sovereignty and so forth. And in my experience, not once did any of my professors ever talk about the ethics of collecting human remains. So I grew up thinking, well, this is science, this is cool, you know. And it really wasn't until the early 70s, during this period of Native American activism, that, you know, wheels started turning among a lot of archaeologists. But it took another 20 years before of intense activism before the law was passed in 1990. And a lot of archaeologists at that time were very upset because they saw this as dipping into their research, their science. And what emerged was a you know, real bitter conflict, I think, for a period of time. It's curious that I came to Grand Valley in 1990 and immediately realized that that's, you know, that I had a responsibility to do the right thing. I knew the Battle Point collection was present and something of the history of it. And so we started, I'm slipping into the next question about GVSU's history a little bit. We actually began our inventory in 1990 and were not able to complete it because we were doing it with, you know, on a shoestring and a prayer, kind of. We published our first inventory, I think, in 1995. And in the meantime, I think Jay and I had met or talked. In particular, one of the things that I discovered when I was going through the records about the Battle Point site was a chain of title. And the chain of title listed one of Jay's relatives in it. And I thought, well, there's some pretty strong evidence of lineal descent, you know, which is what the law, which is what the law required, that we consider repatriation of remains where we could demonstrate lineal descent. That was in the initial version that was passed in 1990. There also was contention over the issue of unaffiliated remains, and these would be remains that could not be directly through something like a chain of title affiliated with groups that were present in the area at the time of treaty signing. And so amendments to, or additions to the law were passed in 2010, as I mentioned, that also required the return of unaffiliated remains. And that took some more time to negotiate all of that and figure that out. I think that's where there have been some sticking points that some museums and universities were concerned about. But anyway, Jay and I started talking about the repatriation of the remains, and we actually did not conclude that until not in the 90s. It was 2001, I think.
Yeah.
That was the Battle Point site, and then we also repatriated all of our unaffiliated remains to Little River in 2018, was it, Jay? 2017, 2018?
Yeah, somewhere in there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so some of them went to Little River and some of them went to another federally recognized tribe, the Pokagon Band. Oh, no, Machbanashuish, which are the folks who are around Gun Lake. So as of 2018, to my knowledge, GVSU holds no more human remains.
Yes, thanks for that, Jan. And just to clarify, because I did have somebody ask, this question previous to us scheduling this event, sometimes people are a little surprised that Grand Valley had held human remains and other objects of this nature, because of course, Grand Valley State University didn't exist in the 19th century. These are remains that were collected from a site very near to Grand Valley's campus. Of Native American people by GVSU former professors and students in the 1970s.
Yeah, I think that work was done in the 1970s. So yes, my predecessor, and he was of this school that, this is research and science. Became aware of the site because it was being looted on the one hand by avocational or hobbyist folks. And at the same time, it's located on the banks of the Grand River. And in the spring, when the ice broke up, it would chew away at the bank and burials would be eroded and people would swarm all over and collect things. So my predecessor, Richard Flanders, did excavate at the site, and there was a collection, and there's a private collection also. And I did not work at the site, but every spring when the river would churn things up, I'd get a call from somebody, hey, we found some stuff out there. And that led to one of Jay's and my collaborations. We actually worked with the DNR and they were the former Soil Conservation Service. I can't remember what their acronym is now. Did a temporary patching to keep things from eroding, and then worked with the state and the Army Corps of Engineers, and it was a big, huge, production to permanently cap that place. So we did not, so there are no more remains eroding, which is a good thing.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that background, Jan. And I definitely did want to pivot to Jay for a moment, because I wanted to hear from your perspective as well about the repatriation of remains from the Battle Point site. I think I'm wondering, and others might be as well, how you came to originally find out that Grand Valley State University had these remains, sort of how you got involved in this, if you would.
Sure, and for us, we had, during the whole run up and initial work with the Nagpra Act, we couldn't directly take action, so we were unofficially being consulted with or talked to until '94, when we were reaffirmed. And once we were reaffirmed, one of the first things that came up was, well, there's this issue we've talked about in the past at Grand Valley, and Nagpra covers it. And surprising, it was the first time we got involved with the act on an official capacity. So our first run at this whole thing was through what happened to repatriate Battle Point and to protect the site because of the information Jan had provided. All we knew up to that point was the lucky sort of protection we could give sites or handle things from prior to being federally reaffirmed through non-contentious cooperative efforts in other areas in Manistee County or along the shoreline or along the Grand River. And our actions was a direct result of being in contact with Jan through for the Battle Point site. If she'd have done like others had done, and there are a lot of examples, one that's not related would be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who relicensed Tippy Dam, saying there were no Indian tribes in the area, relicensed the dam in '98. We'd been here 4 years, living on the river they're talking about. But because when they started the process, it was 93 or 94 early, they just said, nope, we don't have to adjust that. But at least in this case, the interest to do the right thing and the interest to be active in this area coincided perfectly. And we were very determined to do it as possibly right and as correct as necessary or proper. And we were happy to take part. I know some of the communication we had before we actually started consulting on the repatriation issue was we consulted on care and storage, which that's one of the first times that was to take place. Other places now do it all the time. And I can say that U of M's current stance on Nagpra reflects very well on the fact that their person in charge of the process was one of Jan's students. And so they do a great job of following both the law and asking for any traditional overlays we want to do or things that we think are important as a tribe. I want to say that we would have probably actually put off delving into the Nagpra stuff till we joined Nagpra. I think it was 96 when we joined Nagpra. Till that point, as a newly reaffirmed federal tribe, except that we had already had the contact, we'd already done some of the groundwork, and things were working so smoothly, we just assumed it was always going to be smooth. We just assumed this is what's going to happen. It isn't. It hasn't been. But that particular example, that particular experience shows what could have been and maybe should have been what happened. And we're happy to have taken part and been able to do what we do to protect our ancestors and to provide a chance for other people to learn from examples.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it's good to talk about both. And I appreciate that you talked about both the good interactions that you had in terms of trying to get Nagpra to work to honor your ancestors and the tribe's ancestors, and also some of the negative and very unsatisfying, I think, experiences that you had in the 90s and later with other institutions in Michigan. And I think that mirrors too what we've learned about how Nagpra has existed over the last 30 years across the country, that some groups have had very satisfying experiences with institutions and museums, and some not so much at all, and then a lot sort of in the mushy middle somewhere. And I'm glad you highlighted too, for those who aren't familiar with it, that in order, NAGPRA is a law created by the US government. And in order to take advantage of that, you have to be a federally recognized group sort of under the US law. And of course, there are native tribes and nations that are not federally recognized. And, they have a very different experience, maybe trying to do anything. with Nagpra or with places they know might hold remains of their ancestors as well. So going sort of to talk a little bit more about this repatriation of specifically the Battle Point material, remains and other objects, I wondered if either one of you would talk a little bit more just about the process of how those
Sorry about that.
remains were transferred, and then
Yes.
what happens to those remains after they have been repatriated.
Well, could you have them
Sorry, I think Jay
contact
has
our
got
main,
a
'cause it's
call.
it's supposed to be the 9th.
I think Jay has had an emergency call. Maybe Jan, you could weigh in on this for a moment.
Sure. I do want to defer to Jay about what happens once the remains are repatriated, but
Yes, of course.
we agreed on a time and a day, and Jay and several members of the tribe came to the university, and Jay, you're muted.
Yep.
There. Am I unmuted again? There we go.
Yes, you are.
okay
Sorry
now.
about that.
But anyway, you know, basically Jay and several members of the tribe came to the university, and we had a smudging ceremony, and the remains were packed up, and I was invited to participate in the reburial ceremony. It was an honor to be invited, but I think Jay should be the one to share the rest of the story.
Yes, and what you want to share about it, Jay.
Well, we went down, as she said, and we smudged the area to bring the positive energy in and remove some of the negative energy. We respectfully returned the remains. We made sure they were prepared in a traditional manner. In some cases with the tribes, that means that you have to have women come in and make sure that the remains are bundled properly or cared for, because that's who used to take care of the dead. And then we did indeed rebury. We don't generally hold Little River doesn't hold a full-fledged funeral because these folks already had one, but we do like to honor the folks. One of the things we do is we apologize that they weren't allowed to just stay where they had been, and then we promise that as long as we exist, where they are now is where they'll stay. And we invited Jan because, again, Jan made it much easier than other people had that we had started running into. And I personally think, you know, I can understand where some folks get kind of like a parent over the remains, because they belong in the museum or they belong in the university, and it's something these people that they've dealt with for a long time, and then suddenly they have to go away. And I wanted to give Jan a chance to have some closure for that, because I think it's important that the people at that point get closer to see what happens for us when we take over, and they know that we're not just, you know, opening a pit up and dumping everything in and not being respectful, not being treating with dignity any of the things that we are dealing with. And I think that I felt that it was important, and we still feel it's important for folks that seem to have that same feeling be invited. There have been repatriations where the individuals have fought right up to taking possession. And those individuals don't get asked to come because, you know, if you're going to fight so hard, and one of the things they use is the term unassociated. These are unassociated remains, so we can't return them. Well, they did amend Nagpra to cover that. And so now those folks are running into that issue and are having to take steps to repatriate things that they fought for these 30 years not to. And some of those folks probably won't be allowed to come in and take part in the reburial.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important for us to make sure that our allies and our friends understand that they're our allies and our friends. And we do what we can for them, just as we did for the ancestors. Because they took care of the ancestors for a lot longer than some of us. And we appreciated it.
Thank you, Jay, for that, and for being so forthcoming about, you know, how you have managed this relationship and how, you know, the different ways that it can go depending on how people react from museums and institutions. You know, and I appreciate you sharing that with us for sure. And I'm sure the audience does as well. So our last final question for both panelists before we get to the audience questions. And so I just like to mention that here because if you want to begin chatting your questions now, if any, we'll start to collect those. But we have one broader question while you're sort of formulating your thoughts out there. And that is, well, what's going on for Nagpra today, you know, either locally here in Michigan or more broadly? What should people know about this, you know, today at 2021?
Go ahead, Jay.
Okay, I'll go ahead. People should understand that the process is still ongoing. There have been places that dug in and fought. Ironically, one of them repatriated something right after we repatriated from Grand Valley. They said we can affiliate this. Well, we want to repatriate it. It was a single item, a skull. And then all the stuff related to that item or from the same site, they said we can't affiliate. And the fight was on, and the fight took quite a while. Now they brought in new staff people and decided they're going to go the other way, and that's the aforementioned University of Michigan. And they're moving forward cautiously but respectfully, and we understand that now because we see movement. As I said, I just repatriated some remains from there. I think it was about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, getting ready for reburial. And the Michigan and Islamic Cultural Preservation and Repatriation Alliance, all the federal tribes in Michigan, now can act and have been acceptable to act as a block so that we can say, okay, you have remains from this area. This tribe is the one that's going to repatriate them, and the rest of us all agree that that's how it should be done. And that's sped or allowed the process to move forward. It has still, in some places, probably is contentious. But once we started moving forward and having success, I can also say that other places tend to just show up and say, here are remains we had that we shouldn't. And that kind of, that's unexpectedly good. But then again, it's something you don't really anticipate, that somebody would just show up and say, my uncle dug these up a long time ago in this area, and we figured it must be you that can take care of them. Thanks, see ya. One of the things I like to joke about too is I get calls from the state police posts. There's been an inadvertent discovery of a body. And so as a joke, I always ask them, is it a fresh one or an old one?
Yeah.
And when they ask why I want to know, I tell them, well, if it's a fresh one, I should probably get an attorney.
Jay.
But Jay raises a really important point, and that is that there are inadvertent discoveries that occur all the time. Somebody is building a house on the river. This is a project that we had actually in the 90s also. And when they were digging the foundation, human remains were found. And so, without Nagpra, there would be no process or procedure for how to handle those. And Nagpra is a living, breathing document that does provide guidance for how we deal with inadvertent discoveries. And I'm glad that there is something like that, because as Jay has indicated, the relationships are not always smooth, but at least we have a meeting ground, a point, a framework where we can begin to talk with each other. And I think that in that sense, that Nagpra has been very, very successful.
Well, I'm not going to say it hasn't been successful, in that we've repatriated, including Battle Point and other sites. Little River has returned ancestors and placed them in our repatriation cemetery. And we've probably repatriated a little over 3,000 individuals, plus some of their funeral items that when they had them. So that's pretty successful.
That's successful.
The organization, the Nagpra organization, has, to our knowledge, 2 universities in Michigan that we're still working with, and 2 outside of Michigan. And then we'll have covered 99% of the places that turned in inventories. So it's been successful. It's been a good thing. And inadvertent discoveries we've had one in Manistee just 2 years ago for a consumers project where they were rehabbing a former gas plant site, and they found human remains. And that went really smooth because the Corps of Engineers got involved and kind of took the remains under their guise. And so Nagpra applied, and we could just handle it that way. Saginaw Chippewa in the past had you're talking about housing, it reminded me they had an issue in Flint.
Yep.
The Stone Street housing project uncovered a massive burial. And so they had to work together, which they did, to resolve that ip and handle those remains in a respectful way, which happened. And that's all because of the Nagpra Act, and all because of the good people who follow the act and set the example. Otherwise, and we find we have more commonality once we get in consultation than actual adversarial roles, that all of us are all concerned about the same thing. And that's the ancestors we're talking about. In one form or another, that's what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yes, thank you both for talking about that once again. And I think that I want to make sure that we get to at least a couple of the audience questions that we have coming in. So one question, I think we can explain the answer to this one pretty briefly. So I'll start with it. Is about whether or not remains, do you try to, the person says, do you try to repatriate remains to the site where they were collected? Much of this must be private property now. How do you handle that? And I guess I think that maybe, first of all, the audience should know that by repatriate, right, we mean repatriating these remains to the people to whom they belong, which are their, descendants and descendant groups. It's not, the intent is not necessarily to move them back to a site to which they were originally buried. Am I correct in that, you two, or?
Yeah, and the facts are that if there's a site that we can get agreement on, we have had things repatriated from Mackinac Island to Sault Ste. Marie and then reinterred on Mackinac Island in the cemetery adjacent to where they had been removed from. And whenever we can, we try to do that. And that's kind of how we choose who repatriates what site. If it's not closely affiliated, is who's closest, so that we don't have to move them very far in a lot of cases. And we try not to move them from, say, the Indiana border into the UP for Lac Vie des Airs, unless we can show the throne from Lac Vie des Airs. We tend to, that area tends to be one of the Potawatomi tribes will handle those southern remains. We handle the ones kind of in the middle and for the Grand River. And we work at it that way. Our efforts are always to find the closest place, and if possible, if at all possible, we have repatriated, taken possession, and reburied sites actually on the same property. We had that happen with one of the schools along the coastline. They were doing a new building, found some remains. We went and helped them repatriate them or take care of them the proper way. And then they returned them and set aside a chunk of their property to rebury them on. So they were basically buried in the same site. But for us, we if that's not possible, we bring them up and we have a specific spot in our own tribal cemetery that's strictly for reburying the ancestors. And Saginaw Chippewa has one. Most of the tribes now have one. And that's how we have to do it, is because you can't return some ancestors to the site they came from because it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. And that was also a problem a little bit with Battle Point because of the erosion that had existed there and does exist. And I think we have a question kind of along that lines from the audience as well. Somebody wants to know, how is Battle Site currently protected? From what I've seen of the land, it looks like it's open and that people could otherwise easily dig or otherwise disturb burials. Who owns this land now?
Yeah, so that is a good point. And I think that's, it was a wise decision to not rebury them at Battle Point. It is public land owned by the state of Michigan. It is at a boat launch on the Grand, and the site itself is, the last time I was there, maybe a year or so ago, they're allowing the vegetation to grow up, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult to navigate there. But the actions that the state and the tribe and various federal agencies took to protect the site seem to be working. There's nothing to entice people there any longer. There's no erosion. There's no visible sign that there's anything. Now, would some person who wants to get arrested take the opportunity to go and dig there? They could, but I don't think that that's going to happen. I think that's been dealt with.
Okay.
But I think that was a wise decision to not rebury them there on the tribe's part, because it is public land and it's open. And then there's another issue, I think, is the issue of ownership, because the institutions that had held these remains may have excavated things on private property. You don't want to repatriate to private property, because a person can do whatever they want on private property. Private individuals are not subject to Nagpra. So I get asked this question, if I have a burial mound on my property, I can dig it up. If nobody can keep me from doing that. And I said, that is technically true in the state of Michigan, but in other states, there are strong burial protection laws that pertain to private property. But yeah, you don't want to rebury on private property. You don't want to rebury in public land. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jan.
That's one of the criteria we use when we pick a site, not in a tribal reservation, not on tribal land, is that it has to be something we know can be protected.
Right.
And if we can't get any guarantee of protection, then we don't do it.
Mm.
And yes, if people find that there are burials on their property, what they do with the burials, we can't officially do anything for. We do remind them that they have to report that they found a set of human remains to the state police or the county sheriff at the very least, who then try to get us involved so that the person, if they don't want to keep them, we can take them for them. And sometimes when I get involved, I like to ask if they ever saw poltergeist. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just asking.
Well, sometimes you just have to get things done however you can, sometimes maybe that could be a successful tactic, Jay. It sounds like it has been.
Well, yeah, we had a gentleman in Bear Lake. That's why he called us. Was he called the sheriff, then he called us almost within minutes of calling the sheriff. And then the sheriff contacted us to come up because he had mentioned the tribe. And his whole concern was he didn't want what happened in Poltergeist to happen on his new home on the lake. And so we did what we could for him and tried to let him know that not everything you see in a movie is necessarily a fact.
Yes, that's a good thing for people to learn. I agree. Speaking of tactics, I think that we have a couple questions actually asking you in particular, Jay, if you would elaborate about Nagpra and what it is and how it affected the success of certain repatriation efforts in Michigan. Do you think it's a good model for other groups in other states?
The Michigan Islamic Cultural Preservation and Repatriation Alliance, because we can't ever just name something short, or Nagpra, it's been a very successful organization, and it was formed. Little River is one of the, as they call it now, the signatory tribes. The first step for the organization was that all the tribes agreed in a letter of agreement to each other what was important. And when it came to the ancestors, the return of the ancestors, and dignified care if during that process was important. The organization's been, as I said, greatly successful because we found we had National Nagpra organization recognize that as a consortium, we were just the Anishinaabe. So where we had anything to say in Michigan and in some other museums that had sites from Michigan, that the Anishinaabe were speaking, that the individual tribes were actually more like the old villages and individual things of that nature. And you had all of the federal tribes in Michigan and Grand River Band and Burt Lake Band who are represented in the organization, speaking as one voice on how we wanted to handle unaffiliated stuff. Well, wait a minute. It's got to be affiliated to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So we have been very successful in using that consortium and that agreed group of dedicated individuals who have other jobs like me, but do spend time looking out for things of repatriation and Nagpra related issues. I told them it's sad because we've been doing that for so long since we formed. Now we're going to get to a point where maybe we won't have anybody to repatriate anywhere, which would be great, except then we have to go back to that cultural preservation part. And that's even more contentious among tribes than repatriating ancestors.
Yes.
The organization has been successful. And as an example, National Nagpra has mentioned that Wisconsin has a group forming up to do the same thing. And I believe they said Alaska's native corporations have formed a consortium to do so. And since that can be recognized, it should help them work with the folks who are more or less contentious about things. Because it's okay to put off one tribe. It's a little tougher when you put off 12, 14, something like that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad too that you brought up the cultural preservation piece, because it helps us to remind everybody in the audience that, you know, there are many different tribes and groups, native groups in Michigan, and you know, they have their own particular histories and also histories with each other. And you could easily see how absent Nagpra, there could have been a lot more contention, and, you know, the overall effort could have been much weaker. You know, for example, if tribes were arguing with each other, you know, then an institution could say, well, we don't really, you know, you guys, we don't want to pick a side here, and you guys avoided that.
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the ways some of those who have stalled the process or slowed the process, that's what they did, is they would contact Saginaw Chippewa, they would contact Little River, they would contact Matchubi-Nashawish, and say, these could be affiliated to you. Do you think you should be the one to repatriate them? And if they got all three to say yes, under the old system, that meant that they couldn't be affiliated to any one. And we'd have to fight among ourselves to prove affiliation. And they were hoping that the divided effort would allow for a longer period of time fighting. And recognizing that that was a tactic, we opted to go the other way and say, what's most important to Nagpra is we want to take possession of the ancestors. Then we have a system, we get together and we have a system to know where they're going to go. We make that decision out before we apply or ask to repatriate and consult. And then everybody supports it. And there's no way to use, well, they could be this tribe or that tribe against the organization, because everybody's there. Whoever's asked to be the main repatriation agent is got the rest of us standing behind them. And so there's no separation of purpose or contention of what's happening. And that's how it's worked so well.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great place to probably end our discussion here as well. Sort of re-emphasizing the power of coalitions of different groups historically to work as allies, both with it amongst themselves and outside the group with anthropologists like Jan, who were cooperative and eager to implement Nagpra. And that's a sort of a good lesson maybe to end this conversation on when we're talking about this kind of issue. So I would like to, I know we didn't get to all the audience questions, but we are over time. I apologize for that, although I'm really energized by the amount of attendees and also the questions that you have. As we move towards the end again, I would like to thank you all again so much for being here, both the panelists and the audience. Before we close, I want to make sure you all know the presentation is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel next week so that you can share it with others. And I also want to let you know that this is the final event as part of our Time Traveler series, but we here at the Cucci Center will continue with both digital and in-person programming in the new year coming up on us very shortly. Before that, though, before next year, we do have one final video premiere for December, the presentation of the annual Gordon Olson Award to Lowell Area Historical Museum's Executive Director, Lisa Plank, which will be also on our YouTube channel next week. And at that time, we're going to start soliciting nominations for the 2022 Gordon Olson Award. So this award honors those whose work embodies the Cucci office's mission and also comes with a small monetary award money. So if you know somebody in the West Michigan area who has used history to give voice to diverse communities locally, do contact us so that we can help you to nominate them for this special recognition. Lastly, I was asked by the Department of Anthropology to announce that they are hiring for an open rank position in Great Lakes Archaeology and Indigenous people. This will be the person who will not actually replace Jan, because we can't replace Jan, but who will take up her work and her legacy here at Grand Valley. And you can find out more about that position on GVSU's jobs website. So before we close, I'd like to say thank you so much again to our panelists, and that myself and my colleague here at the Cucci office, Mary Williford, hope to speak with you soon about our West Michigan history. Thanks, everybody.